Death rides the red. Let's get straight into that. Eamon Hargus liked his new boss. He also liked his new line of work. Actually, killing for the government was his old line of work, but what the hell. Hotchkiss appreciated his talents more than the Confederate Army ever did, and, unlike Morgan and Corbin, Hotchkiss wasn't out to kill him. Going to see the congressman was the best idea he ever had. Hotchkiss was ambitious, and ambitious men made good listeners. The really ambitious ones were also the most willing to believe the worst. Men like Hotchkiss don't doubt the government's use of werewolves as weapons. They were the ones who pushed the idea into life. It was men like Hotchkiss that freed him from prison. With no war to fight, Congressman Hotchkiss was only too ready to employ him for their own purposes. One simple, brief demonstration of Eamon's talents, and Hotchkiss was an instant visionary. The congressman saw the possibilities of having a genuine lycanthrope on the payroll. Eamon was certain John Hotchkiss was a man who would go to the ends of the earth to protect his vision and his investments. Hargus found the whole business ironic and rather amusing. What better place to hide from the government than in its employee? There was just a delicious rightness about the arrangement. It wasn't like Hotchkiss was his only option. Washington was full of men willing to subjugate morals to crowning ambition. Well, actually, Washington was getting a bit crowded. Texas was a wide world of possibilities. Eamon Hargus was a man with a vision too. Hotchkiss was not going to last long in Washington. He knew it, and Hotchkiss knew it too. Reconstruction was terminally ill, but for the moment, it was the best game in town. Once the army left, the still smoking ruins of the South were ripe for empire building, and Hotchkiss, for all his faults, was a builder. There wasn't money in Texas cattle, not yet, but it was coming. Hotchkiss saw it. Hotchkiss also saw the money to be made from selling whiskey in Indian territory. The money was good, but it wasn't the real prize. The Indian lands would be opened up for white expansion, and it was only a matter of time. And when the time came, Hotchkiss planned to already have his hooks deep into the land across the Red River. Hargus planned to be there too, to get his share and maybe a little more. Eamon had no trouble finding the Undertaker's place. All he had to do was follow his nose. The place had a distinct and not unpleasant odour. It smelled like death, and that was a smell Eamon Hargus could live with. A tiny bell tinkled as Hargus stepped through Wentworth's front door. He couldn't help thinking the Undertaker did pretty well for himself. The parlour looked like a well-appointed Washington apartment. Thick rugs on the floor, richly upholstered chairs lined 3 of the walls. In the centre of the room, a raised wooden platform was reserved for the many guests of honour and their coffins. Heavy draperies kept the room dark and cool. Another small bell sat on a table on the corner of the room for mourners and to summon the host. Hargus ignored the second bell. He could hear Wentworth moving around at the rear of the building. He would just drop in on the Undertaker for a private chat. And the stranger caught the Undertaker by surprise. Wentworth was on his hands and knees, humming to himself and arranging supplies on one of the bottom shelves when Hargus slipped noiselessly into the room. Wentworth sensed rather than heard movement behind him. He whirled around in a jumble of long arms and legs, and the tall man standing in a work room smiled at Jeremy's surprise. He introduced himself as Eamon Hargus, security chief for the Honourable John Hotchkiss. Hargus continued to smile and chat him up about the Hotchkiss murders, but Wentworth knew what Hargus was from the very start. The Russians had used werewolves in Crimea. Why not? Eastern Europe was full of them. The British weren't finding the Black Sea to their tastes. Disease was rampant in their camps. The Russians simply thought to add a terror by night. Jeremy Wentworth had a peculiar talent of being able to spot them in daylight or moonlight. It turned out to be a talent Lord Cardigan found very useful. Jeremy walked among the Russian prisoners, pointed out the planted werewolves, and they were promptly dispatched. Later, the headless bodies found their way back to the Russian lines. Each corpse returned to the Russians bore the image of a wolf burned into the chest. Mr. Hargis had a lot of questions for Jeremy. How the Hotchkiss men died. What did Jeremy think made the wounds? Who had been around asking questions afterwards? And what did Jeremy tell the sheriff? The conversation went on much longer than Jeremy liked. Perhaps, Jeremy thought, if he had been a skilled liar, he could be quietly sipping brandy right now. And despite his efforts to appear to be the detached professional, sweat ran from Jeremy's every pore. Small rivulets ran down his temples, and he was sure Hargis smelled the fear that washed over him. Although Hargis maintained an innocent smile through the entire interview, his eyes told a different story. Hargis saw through his carefully worded deception, and Jeremy knew the monster in the room read him well. Certainly well enough to know that Jeremy couldn't reach the knife in his boot fast enough to be a real threat. When Hargis finally left, Wentworth locked up the shop, threw a few war mementos in his saddlebags and rode flat out for the Lazy L. He prayed he would make it before dark. Tonight would be a 3/4 moon, and some human feelings might remain in Hargis, but Wentworth doubted much humanity remained in Hargis at his best. Nate Carson might not be much help to Jeremy, but he would need no convincing and no lengthy explanations. Somehow, Carson knew the real truth even before he came to see Jeremy. When Jeremy passed over 8 Mile Hill without drawing any more attention, he knew he would make it to the Lazy L. Wentworth was much better in the saddle than the man Hargis sent to watch him. He rode with a British light horse at Balaclava. He found it rather poetic that riding for his life still brought out the best in him. Dark was still an hour away. He was going to make it. Unfortunately for Wentworth, Eamon Hargis was not pursuing him. He was waiting for him. The tall man stepped out of a stand of oaks in the middle of the road, and Jeremy didn't need to rein in. His frightened horse bounced off to a stiff-legged halt and tried to back away from the beast in the road. Hargis caught the reins and pulled the horse and rider to him. "You're in a awful big hurry, Mr. Wentworth," Hargis said. "Where are you going?" Jeremy slid the silver blade from the boot opposite Hargis. "I'm going to see Ned Carson at the Lazy L. Now, release my horse. I must be on my way." "Why would the town's undertaker be going to see Mr. Carson this time of evening? He isn't dead, is he?" "Certainly not. It's a personal matter, so I'll thank you to stand aside." "Okay, I'll let you pass. But first, you hand over that fancy knife you're holding. Gently now." "I think not," Wentworth said. "Then I'll be forced to take it from you." "You are welcome to try, Mr. Hargis, but more than one of your kind has died trying that particular task." "My kind? What kind is that?" "Werewolves," Wentworth said. Hargis threw back his head and laughed, and when the laughter died, he smiled up at the undertaker and released the reins. "My dear Mr. Wentworth," he began, "there's no such thing as werewolves. Relax. I'm not going to eat you." Hargis drew his gun and shot Jeremy Wentworth in the right shoulder. The knife fell to the dirt. "Not when I can simply shoot you and blame it on your friend, Nate Carson," Hargis said and fired into Jeremy's abdomen. Jeremy Wentworth flew back with the impact but managed to stay in the saddle. And clinging to the saddle horn, he slumped forward. His guts were on fire. Wentworth buried his heels to the horse's flanks, and the saddle horse jumped to life and raced towards the Lazy L. As the bleeding undertaker passed, Hargis picked up the knife and tucked it into his belt. "Oh, and Mr. Wentworth, be sure to tell Mr. Carson I'll be around later tonight to pay my respects." "Jason, you want to ride out to the Lazy L?" Sam said. What, now? It's nearly dark. Yes, now. You tell Nate that I want to know how he knew about those murders in Whitesboro. Tell him I expect a name. Hotchkiss and I are done swapping lies for the day. What we need now is a little more truth-telling around this town. Carson knows more than he's telling, and I want to know everything he knows. You tell him that too. What makes you think he'll tell me anything? I don't recall he will. Not right off. You're gonna tell him about Hotchkiss coming to visit. Tell him the only way I can keep Hotchkiss from bringing government people into this is to give me something that I can use to find the killers. Tell him I'll be waiting to hear from him. Then just leave him to think it over. Okay, Sheriff, if you say so. Get moving. You can be back by midnight if you don't dawdle. You stop here first when you get back. I want to know how it goes with Carson, and I want to know tonight. Sure thing, Jason said and was out the door. A moment later, Jason Conroe crashed back through the door. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and his lips moved in a frantic search for a voice. Jason? Sam said. What is it? The sheriff started around his desk, and the movement helped Jason to find the words he wanted. Oh, Jesus! Mary and Joseph! Get out of here, Sam! All his adult life, Sam Bryan had reserved running only for occasions when he was being shot at or needed cover. His deputy's panic persuaded him to make an exception in this case. In the street outside sat Red Garland's run-down old wagon. Red stood beside his team while the cargo in his wagon drew flies and Texomans. Garland lived a mile downstream in Colbert's Ferry. He was considered the undisputed master noodler around Texoma. Near his place on the river, Red had stuck his bare hand into the mouths of some of the monster-sized catfish and pulled them from their holes. An angry beaver once reprimanded Red for disturbing a peace by laying open his arm from wrist to elbow. But Red still practiced his art. Red also enjoyed showing off his biggest prizes by hauling them into town in his wagon. And Sam's anger began to boil and he slowed to a walk. Damn you, Jason Conroe, for dragging me out like that to see some The words caught in Sam's throat. Several of the curious made an abrupt turn from Red's wagon and vomited their partially digested dinners into the street. A sick feeling of certainty washed over Sam Bryan. Sam peered into Red's wagon knowing he didn't want to see, but sure he must. And from the wagon bed, the eyeless, bloated, blue-faced grey of Pete Seeley stared back at him. The upper torso, right arm and head were all that remained of John Hotchkiss's missing cowhand. Sam's stomach convulsed and his skin beaded with clammy sweat as waves of nausea rolled up into his throat. He fought back the urge to vomit. For God's sake, get that thing off the streets, Sam ordered Jason. Take it to Wentworth's. Sam turned on the crowd. All right now, that's enough. Everybody get. Y'all hear me? Clear this street and I mean right now. The frightened residents of Texoma reluctantly complied and started for their homes in a slow mosey. Jason jumped aboard Garland's wagon, waved Garland into the seat beside him, and started for the undertaker's place. Sam waited for the street and his head to clear before returning to his office. Once inside, the sheriff cradled his throbbing head in his hands. Sam wasn't a churchgoer, but he sent up a silent prayer in case God happened to be listening. Sam needed all the divine help that he could get, and a stiff shot from a bottle in his desk. An hour later, Jason was back and looking worried. The news he brought did nothing to brighten his employer's day. While Sam sat at his desk, rubbing his temples, Jason slid into the empty chair and waited. As the waited stretched out, Jason began to fidget. Sam? He said at last. What is it, Jason? Sam whispered. It's Wentworth, Sam. He's gone. Sam looked up at the nervous deputy and met Jason's eyes and leaned closer. What do you mean, he's gone? Sam asked. Just that, Sheriff. He's gone. He's not at his place and nobody's seen him for hours. His horse is gone too. Red and I searched all over town, but there's no sign of him. What did y'all do with Pete? I got Red to help me put him in Wentworth's cold room. Well, that will do for now. I reckon I know how Red found him. Did Red find any sign of Newt? Nope. Not likely to happen soon either. Red said he was staying home for a spell. Laying hold of old Pete that way has put him off of his fishing. He said he'd rather grab a beaver any day. I reckon he would at that. This thing's getting to be like quicksand. We keep sinking deeper and deeper. It's too late to start you to that lazy L today. We'll keep watch for Wentworth to show, and you can ride out to see Carson in the morning. Sam reached out into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out the bottle again. Care for a little something to take the edge off? Sam asked. Jack and Nick retraced their steps back to the horses on the north bank, and dressed once more, they mounted up and pushed east along the river, meaning to go on to Cowboys ferry. There was a telegraph line near the ferry, and Jack lost a coin toss this time. He scaled the pole and secured himself at the top before hooking into the line and tapping out a message. Texoma, looking into Hotchkiss murders. No contact with local law. On right trail, Morgan. He did not wait for a reply. He scurried down the pole and they set out for the Lazy L. It was growing dark by the time Jack and Nick reached the ranch house. The interior of the house smelled like prime beef, biscuits, and hot coffee. Jack's empty stomach growled a welcome to the delightful aromas. My stomach thinks my throat has been cut, Jack announced. Mine too, Nick echoed in sentiment and snatched a golden cathead biscuit from the platter. He tried, unsuccessfully, to stuff the whole thing in his mouth at once. Your stomach has a one-track mind, Nate grinned. Comes from years of being hungry. Jimmy dropped huge slabs of beef in front of Jack and Nick. God bless you, Jack said. The two men tore into the steaks with a carnivorous relish and mopped up the drippings with their biscuits. After the steaks vanished, Nate produced a jug of John Hotchkiss's finest to wash away the day. I could get used to this real easy, Nick said through the last of the biscuits. He patted his bulging stomach with both hands, and Jack leaned back in his chair and did likewise. Nate, tell us what you found in town. We'll just sit and digest a spell, Jack said. Well, most of what I heard was nothing but wild rumors. The town's ready to blame renegade Comanches. However, I did come across a few truths that are of interest. First, the murder was definitely planned. John and Henry were tied up before they died. The sheriff is guessing they were tied while the killers either searched the house or tried to beat something out of them. The undertaker agrees. Jeremy Wentworth has seen a lot of wounds. He was with the British in Crimea. He says no weapon was found that could have made the wounds he saw. He doesn't think one exists. He said their throats weren't cut. They were ripped by teeth. In fact, he said it looked like the work of a werewolf. Nick startled. His chair overbalanced and teetered backwards precariously. Nick caught the table in time to save himself from hitting the floor. He said, "What?" Jack coughed. Nate chuckled. He was amused at Jack's astonishment as much as Nick's acrobatics. Yep, you heard right. He said it was a werewolf. I could have lost a farm on that bet. Did he tell that to the sheriff? Jack asked. No, he says he ain't about to either. He only told me because I already knew the truth. Oh, can he be trusted to keep his word? Jack asked. I reckon so, but he better. Jack cut him short. What? I thought you'd be glad to have someone back up your story. You thought wrong. We want to get our man and get out of here like we were never here. What about John's murder? What about it? Do you really think there's going to be a trial? Get that notion out of your head. Me and Nick are going to execute the killer as soon as we put a name on him. Justice will be done, but none of it ever happened. Just leave it at that. And if I don't? We're talking about the federal government and a Republican congressman. What do you think? Nate's eyes narrowed. He jumped up from his chair and turned on Jack, and Jack stood to meet him. They stood eye to eye, jaws tight. Nate's fists clenched and unclenched, his knuckles blanched as his rage looked for somewhere to go. Save your threats. John Hotchkiss was my friend, dammit. You ain't gonna sweep him under the rug with the rest of the rubbish. He's dead. The fire in Jack's eyes abated. He visibly softened. I'm sorry he's dead. I really am, but he is dead. Nothing's gonna change that, and you know it. We plan to exact a measure of revenge on the killer, but there's nothing more we can do. Let it go, please. Just let it go. Nate sighed and sat down at the table and studied his hands. Sheriff Bryan said the house was ransacked, but he's betting there's nothing missing. Nate said at last. He'll know for sure soon because I ran into the next of kin on my way back from town. Congressman Hotchkiss is here at last? Nick said. Yep, Nate answered. Equipped with an armed escort to boot. Sounds like more than the usual bodyguard or two. Right again. 8 armed outriders with shotguns and sidearms. An armed bodyguard in the coach, and a driver who looks like he may have other duties as well. I'd say they're all professionals. That fella in the coach beside Hotchkiss has a big scar down the side of his face. He goes by the name of Hargus. Jack and Nick jumped to attention at the mention of the scarred man. How big a scar? Jack asked. Nate traced a line from his left eye to his chin. Jack and Nick exchanged looks. Sounds like Gus Harmon to me, Jack said. Damn sure it is, Nick added. Let's don't lose him this time. Friend of yours then? Nate asked. We served together in the war. Haven't laid eyes on him since Sailor's Creek, Nick replied. Nate knows Gus? Jack told him. They met at Gettysburg, you remember? Jack's confirmation of the scarred man's identity drained the blood from Nate Carson's face. Nate rose from the table and walked out without a word. Jimmy started to follow, but Jack put a hand on his shoulder and, with a shake of his head, gently pushed the youth back into his seat. Let him be, Jimmy, Jack said. Now Nate stood in the dark with his mind running full speed. He fought to bring his breathing under control. After a few minutes, the surge of anger, mixed with the terror, subsided. A lingering cold fear replaced it, but ultimate control passed to Nate's iron will. He had spent his youth with such feelings and conquered them each time he prepared for battle. Nate was determined to lay to rest this one memory of war that still had the power to drive away his peace. He'd kill it this time or die trying. Either way, this was the end of it. Nate had no delusions that the task would be an easy one. Years ago, he had run a bayonet through the chest of a springing wolf creature. A werewolf, Jack called it. Nate sent the creature flying impaled on his weapon, only to see it rise from the ground, pull the bayonet from its chest, and charge him again. Jack Morgan had saved his life that night. Now the creature was back. It had moved right next door, and Nate accepted the challenge. He had a score to settle. He owed John. He owed his troops. But most of all, he owed himself. Either he or that nightmare creature were going to be planted in Texas soil. Nate heaved a sigh, releasing all the pent-up emotion. As his breath hit bottom, his hand flew to the butt of the Navy Colt at his side. 6 shots blasted the night air. Nate holstered the weapon and walked back to the ranch house. Jimmy exploded from the front door, shotgun in hand, and jumped from the porch, nearly knocking his boss flat. What the hell's going on, Captain? Nate smiled at him and led him back to the house. Old habit, Jimmy. Don't worry. Everything's okay, he explained. Inside, Jack and Nick were still in their seats when Jimmy returned. Their lopsided smiles turned to snickers, and Jimmy's face burned red. What are you two laughing at? Jimmy snapped. Tell you what, kid, Jack replied. You go out to that little oak about 30 yards from the front porch. Take a look at the trunk about 4 feet off the ground. Tell me what you see and I'll tell you what just happened. Jack pushed the lamp across the table towards Jimmy. Jimmy took the light and returned a few moments later, scratching his head. What'd you see? Jack asked. 6 slugs in a group no bigger than my palm, Jimmy answered. You sure it was 6? Sure, I'm sure. I'm mighty glad to hear that, Jimmy. Yes, sir, mighty glad. Sit down over there and let me tell you something about Captain Nate Carson. Jack motioned to the empty chair, and Jimmy sat down between his boss and the stranger. Nate Carson here may be the son of an Atlanta shopkeeper, but he also has the fastest, straightest shot I'd ever seen except maybe Nick here. Back during the war, he had this little ritual. Before every battle, he'd gather up his thoughts, take a deep breath, and fire on some small tree or a fence post. It must have worked because Nate Carson was one hell of a soldier. Whatever you want to call it, it means he's ready to fight. Who we fixing to fight, Captain? Jimmy asked. Jimmy's question was answered a short while later by a second burst of gunfire, followed by a long, wailing howl that rolled over the Texas hills outside. Nick blew out the lamp and pushed Jimmy to the floor, and silver moonlight lit the interior of the house. Nate, use these, Jack whispered. He reached into his saddlebag and handed Nate a handful of cartridges. Jimmy, stick close to me and do exactly as we tell you, Nate ordered. Jack and Nick, revolvers in hand, took up positions by the front windows. Nate led Jimmy across the floor to cover the back door. Everybody, get real still, Nick whispered. Seeing these hard-fighting men scramble for cover was all the encouragement Jimmy needed to become a statue. The undulating howl sounded again, and it was much closer this time. Outside, a twig snapped, and Jimmy jumped. The men inside the house held their breath as the treads on the front steps groaned. Claws clicked and scraped against the wood in measured steps across the porch. The footfall stopped before the front door, but the feeling of someone waiting outside lingered in the air. The visitor worked his way slowly around the house, sniffing at the air outside each window. Once, Nick nodded towards the sound, but Jack shook his head in reply. Then, something hard struck the window frame above Jack's head. The sound was followed by that of something digging deep into the wood. The window began to rise. It opened about an inch and stopped. The sniffing started again. And then there came a sound that turned Jimmy's guts to jelly. It began as some sort of low growl in the back of some huge animal's throat. And slowly the pitch and meter changed in a crazed laugh.
Hello, Jack,
said a voice that raked over vocal cords never meant for speech. It sounded like a rusty nail being ripped from rotten wood. Shoot the bastard, Jack yelled. Nick fired through the open window. Jack slammed into the door, but the door opened only halfway before it slammed closed again, throwing Jack back into the room. He rolled over the table and hit the floor next to Jimmy in a heap. The door smashed its frame and bounced open again with Nick in its wake. The muzzle flash of Nick's revolver marked the pursuit of their phantom attacker across the open field. In the distance, the howl of a wolf floated up from the river. Guess we've been spotted, Nick said when the others had caught up with him. Any doubts that was Harmon? Nope, I reckon not, Jack answered, rubbing his aching shoulder. So, what do we do now? Nate asked. Jimmy supplied the answer. Captain, I think we better find Rafe. Well, I forgot about Rafe, Nate said. He went to check his trout lines. Murders, intrigues, and mysterious guests were not about to keep Rafe Berry from fishing. Neither were the warnings from his boss. Rafe slid his skiff into the river and hopped aboard. He paddled smoothly 100 yards upstream and swung the bow around to let the current carry him along his lines. Rafe hauled in a couple of 10-pound blue cats and a channel cat that weighed at least 20 pounds. Delighted with his catch, Rafe baited his hooks again and made his way back to his launch point. He decided the lines deserved one more check before calling it a night. Rafe built a fire and opened up his cache of fish and supplies. He pulled out a cast iron skillet, set it on the fire, and added some bacon grease. Rafe skinned one of the blues and filleted it with a practiced hand. He rolled the fillets in cornmeal and dropped them into his waiting skillet. Minutes later, Rafe savoured his golden browned catch. It had just the right crunch. However, his impromptu fish fry was interrupted by the sound of gunfire coming from the direction of the ranch house. He threw sand onto the fire, cursing whoever was doing the shooting. He threw the saddle on his horse and started out to see what was going on. More gunfire erupted from the direction of the house. Rafe put the spurs to his horse. He had covered half of the ground between the river and the house when he saw a shadow run across the open ground between two large oak trees. The shadowy figure was too tall to belong to anyone legitimately on the Lazy Elk property. Rafe drew his gun and swung down from his horse. Open ground stretched out between Rafe and the trees. The figure had not moved from his hiding place behind the oak. Surprise seemed unlikely, which was just as well. He preferred to face danger head-on. He approached the stranger in a tight crouch to present as small a target as possible. He reached the big tree without drawing fire from the intruder. Rafe drew up tight against the trunk of the oak, and with a quick twist he rounded the tree and came face to face with no one. The stranger was gone. There were no tracks, no human tracks to be found around the tree. The only impressions in the dirt were clawed with teardrop-shaped toes. They looked more like those of a huge dog or a wolf. And though the tracks were fresh, the figure he saw walked upright. The strange tracks went a few feet away from the tree before they disappeared altogether. He doubled back to start again, dropping down on his good knee for a closer look at the tracks. The moonlight filtering through the tree branches overhead suddenly disappeared. Rafe looked up to see a tall figure unfold itself on the branch above him. The figure, silhouetted against the moon, had a few features, but Rafe had no trouble making out its yellow eyes, long ears, and jewel-coated canines. He fired into the thing's chest. The impact of the slug knocked it from its perch. It hit the ground and air exploded from its wounded chest. The creature rose on its feet. Rafe fired again. The monster was driven back a step but stayed on its feet. Long arms opened as if inviting an embrace, daring Rafe to shoot again. Rafe obliged the creature. He fired a third time and a fourth. The creature merely shrugged and advanced on the bewildered Rafe Berry. It snapped at him like a mad dog and sprang for his throat. Rafe pointed his pistol between the thing's eyes. The creature's arm hit Rafe in the chest and its claws dug deep. Rafe's shot hit only the knight. Strong jaws closed on his neck and Rafe was shaken like a ragdoll. The momentum of his flailing body tore away the skin of Rafe's throat. His trachea, jugular veins and carotid arteries ripped free from their places in a whistling shower of blood. Only Rafe's spine kept his head attached to his body. And as he hit the ground under the weight of the snarling creature, a blinding light rushed up upon Rafe from the surrounding darkness. The light exploded behind his eyes and Rafe was still. The creature spat Rafe's windpipe from its mouth and licked its lips before rising to his feet. Rivulets of blood ran down its upturned jaws. A victorious howl filled the night air. "Nick, cover us," Jack ordered. "Those shots, they came from close by," Nate said. "Rafe must have come back. Fan out." And the four men began a slow, steady march towards the river. Jack led the way while Nick kept a watch at their back. They didn't have to go far. Under a large oak of a quarter-mile from the house, Rafe's body lay in the moonlight that spilled through the trees. Blood pooled beneath the gaping wounds in his chest and throat and plastered his hair to his head. Rafe stared sightlessly skyward. The moon and the stars of Texas night were reflected in the dull, lifeless pools of his eyes. Nate knelt beside his friend. Tears welled up in the ex-soldier's eyes, tears he didn't bother to hide or wipe away. "How many times will I have to do this?" Nate said to himself. "How many friends must I bury?" But Jimmy was frozen to the spot, unable to take his eyes from the gruesome corpse. "Oh, that blood," he mumbled. Jack caught him by the arm and steered the boy away. Jimmy swayed slightly but allowed Jack to lead him back to the house. "We'd all better get inside," Nick warned. "Come on, Nate." "Oh, I can't leave him here," Nate said. Nate lifted Rafael's body onto his shoulder and carried him back to the barn. Rafael had a room inside the barn that he'd built for himself. Nate laid him on the simple bunk and drew a blanket over Rafael's face. He looked up from the body into Nick's eyes. "This is my fault. My little ritual we had such a good laugh about brought him running back and got him killed," Nate said. "You don't know that," Nick assured him. "Now, let's get inside. You'll be okay here until morning and Jimmy's going to need you. Let's get inside." Back inside, Jack gathered them around the table. Jack and Nick still dealt death for a living, but Nate had let the years since the war wear away some of the inner numbness. Jack knew Nate was working hard to summon up his reserves. Nate would be all right. Jimmy was another matter. Shock washed all the colour from Jimmy's face, leaving it the colour of dried paste. The kid looked like he had just been kicked in the gut, and Jimmy had never seen death like this before. He knew only death as a silent disease or news from a far-off battlefield. It was neat and orderly with kinfolks gathered around. The sudden realization that death came to your house, ripped your throat out in little pieces, and spat you out in the dirt was all new to him. The look Jimmy saw on the faces of the older men told him that death made a habit of dismemberment. "Nate, we need to talk. Are you up to it?" Jack asked. "Yeah, sure," Nate replied, not sounding all too sure of anything, but needing to do something besides sit and think about Rafael. "Nate, we're endangering you and Jimmy by being here. Harmon knows we're here. He also knows we mean to kill him and that we won't go away with the deed undone. Hotchkiss has got to know what Harmon is, and that doesn't bode well for any of us. But it's Nick or me that he'll go after. Or if the congressman is behind the murder of his own family, I doubt he'd mind killing us to keep it quiet." "What makes matters worse," Nick added, "is that Hotchkiss can get the law to do his dirty work. Governor Davis has got to get Texas under control, meaning he has to put a stop to the violence aimed at the carpetbagging Republicans and freed Negroes. Davis has poured a lot of the Rangers from fighting Comanches to see that his reforms are carried out. Hotchkiss is a Republican, and by claiming the murders were targeted at him, he can pressure Davis to send the Texas Rangers into this. Hotchkiss will only be too glad to point them at the ex-Confederate officer and his friends living next door. If Nick and I ride out now, maybe he'll consider you adequately warned and let you be. You could always say we forced you to put us up." "Ah, forget it. Jack, I didn't ask for this, but I sure as hell ain't going to run now. I'm in this until that thing is dead." Jimmy found his voice. "I'm with you, Captain. We owe Rafael." "Let's go after the bastard," Nick volunteered. "That's mighty risky business at night," Jack replied. "Who's going to believe us in the morning?" Nate asked. "I know what you're getting at, but believe me, he won't stay a wolf. He'll change back when we kill him." "Whoa, right there?" Jimmy sputtered. "A wolf? What's this about, Captain? Are you saying a wolf did that to Rafael?" "Not exactly a wolf, Jimmy. But then Gus Harmon isn't exactly a man either," Nate said. "He's something called a werewolf," Nick explained. "At night he can transform into something that's part man and part wolf." "That's nonsense," Jimmy said. Despite his brave words, the fear that followed the dawn of belief was creeping into his voice. "Ain't it nonsense, Captain?" "Jimmy, you heard the howling. You saw what Rafael looked like. Yes, it's true. I didn't want to tell you, especially not like this. I hoped I wouldn't have to tell you at all. During the war, I saw these things would work. The murderers Nick and Jack guarded were really a pack of these werewolves. They turned them loose on the Yankees almost every night that the two armies were in camp near each other. Sometimes they got out of control and attacked our boys too. At Gettysburg, they killed my entire squad and would have killed me too, but Jack, he saved my life. We've been hunting them down for the last 4 years, Nick said. But we haven't told either of you the whole truth about it, Jack confessed. We're not actually working for Pinkerton anymore, Nick said. Officially, they wrapped up the case last spring. Pinkerton himself reported to the Secretary of War that all the werewolves were dead. We think the Committee on the Conduct of War pressured Pinkerton into saying so. We also believe that some of the members decided to keep a few of these things around in their employ. John Hotchkiss is a member of that committee. Since finding Harmon here with Hotchkiss, we're sure of it. When we reported through the channels to Pinkerton that there were men unaccounted for, we were sent packing. We didn't give up the hunt. Congress, well, the committee called us in and specifically ordered us to stop poking around in this. And so, technically, we're in contempt of Congress and in a violation of our parole. A Pinkerton man showed up in Whitesboro and tried to get the sheriff there to charge us with the murders. We left town rather quickly. It wouldn't be hard to pin all the werewolf murders on us, including this one, Jack explained. We were always around when these kind of murders occurred, even during the war. It is true we did kill at least one person at every stop along the trail. And that's why you didn't want to be seen in town, Nate observed. Exactly. Now that Hotchkiss knows we're here, he's got another chance to hang us. Well, it's not hard to make two ex-Confederates with a personal scar to settle into would-be assassins. If that's the case, Hotchkiss can't afford to leave Jimmy and me alive, either. Why not? Jimmy asked. We know Jack and Nick didn't kill Rafe. We are their alibi. Hotchkiss can have them arrested, but he can't leave us around to testify. The court might think I'm crazy talking about werewolves, but Jack had it right. Somebody in high places is going to know it's true. That somebody is going to want to silence the whole thing. If others in government are involved, they can't allow Hotchkiss or us to bring the whole thing tumbling down on top of their heads. The government's reaction might be to just silence everybody involved, Nick said. I suppose you're right. That kind of shoots my thinking all to hell, doesn't it? Jack said. Yep, that is as soon as the news of Rafe hits town, Nick said. Well, that doesn't give Hotchkiss much time. Well, he'll be coming after us, hard. Jason rose slowly. Thunder echoed between his ears. His stomach lurched with the sudden change of position, and Jason moaned aloud. He and Sam had done more drinking than watching the night before. Jason could not remember whether or not the wayward undertaker returned. He did not remember. That long after dark, Sam deposited him into an empty bunk and then staggered out of the door. That was right before the jailhouse began to spin out of control. And Jason could see the sun was sitting atop the eastern horizon. Jason stretched the kinks from his muscles. His gait was still a bit unsteady, but he found his way out the back door and to the well. A thin layer of frost covered the grass outside, and he drew up a bucket of the clear, icy water and lifted the dipper to his lips. The cold water helped rinse away the swamp in his mouth. Jason ladled the rest of the bucket's contents over his aching head. He sat on the edge of the well, shivering, and let the morning breeze blow away the cobwebs. And feeling almost alive again, he found his hat, saddled his horse, and started slowly for the Lazy L. The morning sun at his back, he let the sorrel mare have her head. The rising sun chased the frost into the shadows, but neither its warmth nor its brightness could chase away last night's lingering vision of Pete Seeley's corpse in the back of that wagon. Jason imagined Pete lurking behind every tree just beyond the edges of Jason's vision. The vision rode hard on the deputy's frayed nerves. At the foot of 8 Mile Hill, his imagination ran wild. An eyeless horror leered at Jason from behind a large post oak. Jason's mouth went dry and his hand flew to his gun. The Colt trembled in Jason's hand, and the grey-skinned, blue-lipped face of Pete Silly continued to stare back at him. Jason spurred his Sorrel towards the abomination and squeezed off a single round. His shot splintered the oak just below the demon's face. And when he reached the tree, Jason reined in and walked the mare slowly around the tree. He found the blasted bark and his slug buried into the wood, but no sign of a walking corpse, no watery tracks or trail of gore. Only a grey squirrel and the uppermost branches remained to scold the trigger-happy deputy. "Yeah, well, just let that be a warning," Jason told the chatterer. He holstered his weapon and prepared to swing back into the saddle when he saw the blood in the middle of the road. Jason rolled the sticky paste between his fingers. No trick of the imagination this time. This was real blood, and a good deal of it. Jason then followed the trail of blood on foot for nearly a mile. And when the trail turned north towards the river, he mounted up. There was only one place for a wounded man to go in that direction: the Lazy L. Jason found the horse first. The animal was grazing 100 yards off the road, and with the blood-covered saddle still on his back. "Ain't but one man in Texas would dare sit a rig like that," Jason told himself. "Wentworth! Wentworth!" Jason hollered. "Wentworth!" No answer. Jason called the undertaker's horse and returned to the road. The Lazy L was just a few hundred yards over the next hill. Maybe, just maybe, Wentworth could make it on foot. Jason found the undertaker's body propped up against the Lazy L's gate. Jason felt a twinge of guilt at his relief to find that Jeremy Wentworth had only been shot and left to bleed to death on the roadside. The mutilated bodies that kept turning up of late were beyond Jason's comprehension. Gutshot was something he understood. He muscled Wentworth's long-limbed body up across the saddle of his horse. Jason decided to take care of his business at the Lazy L before hauling Wentworth's body back to town. "Rider coming in," Nate called to Jimmy. "Looks like the law to me." "Yep, he's got somebody draped over the saddle too." "Oh, that can't be good." Nate stepped down from his porch to greet his guest, and Jason Conroe reined his horse to the stop in front of Nate's porch. Nate nodded a welcome. "Mind if I step down?" Jason asked. "Help yourself, deputy. Who you got there?" "Jeremy Wentworth," Jason said as Nate lifted the dead man's head. "My God, Jason, what the hell happened?" "I found him out there leaning up against your gate. He's been gutshot. We've been looking for him since yesterday afternoon." "What made you think he'd be here?" "I didn't. I was just on my way out to see you and stumbled across him. I found him here, but he was shot out at 8 Mile Hill." "That probably means he was headed here," Nate offered. "Yep, sure looks that way. Any idea what he was up to?" Jason asked. "Danged if I know," Nate said. "He didn't say anything about coming out here." "Yeah, I heard you two had a private talk over at the Lone Star the other day. Could it be something you talked about?" "I don't see how," Nate replied. "We talked about Henry and John. I wanted Wentworth's thoughts on what killed them. He said he had only seen men killed like that once before." "Is that right? I'm pretty sure he never told that to the sheriff. Why'd he tell you?" Because I'd seen it too, during the war." "Wentworth didn't fight in the war." "No, but he fought Russians back in '54. He said the Russians had some kind of secret weapon that left men looking like that. Although he wouldn't say exactly what it was, he was plenty scared. Guess that's why he didn't tell Sam. Old Honest Abe and Jeff Davis both found a weapon like it, and they kept it secret too." "Ain't Hotchkiss on some kind of committee on the war? Does he know about this secret weapon?" You bet your ass he knows. And what about you? Can't say for certain. That's mighty curious. Well, whether it's can or won't, Sheriff Bryan sent me here with a message for you. A message? Yep, Jason answered. He wants to know the truth about those murders in Whitesboro, how you learned about them, and what they have to do with John and Henry Hotchkiss. The sheriff over there ain't talking, and since you're not exactly a gadabout, Sam figures you or somebody you know has the answer. He doesn't really think you're a murderer, but he says you're gonna have to come in clean. He's waiting to hear from you, but Hotchkiss ain't gonna let him wait long. There may be government men on the way already. Well, that's just great. You know, after the war was over, all I wanted was to get away from the killing and dying. I just wanted to be left alone to put my memories in the grave like I did the men I fought with. How the hell did I end up in the middle of this? I don't rightly know, Nate. But for the first time in my life, I'm glad I missed out on that damn war. So, I delivered the message. It's up to you. I gotta get Wentworth back to town. You think about talking to Sam, you hear? Yeah, sure. I'll do that. Jason nodded and rode away, leaving Nate to ponder how he could make Sam Bryan understand what was at stake and what he faced before somebody else ended up dead. Sam Bryan cursed himself for getting old. He remembered the time he could drink all night and ride all the next day. Now, here he sat, feet propped on the desk, hat covering his eyes, nursing the worst hangover he'd ever had. He heard the office doorknob turn and the door slowly swing open, and soft footsteps entered the office. Morning, Jason, Sam said. Afternoon, Sam, Jason corrected. Sam pushed back his hat to see how his deputy was weathering the night before. There was something troubling Jason, but Sam decided it wasn't a hangover. Face it, Sam, you're getting old, he told himself. And Sam let his boots fall to the floor and turned to face Jason. What's up? Sam asked. I went to see Nate Carson, like you said. And? I think he'll be in soon. Good. Now what's eating at you? I found Jeremy Wentworth too. He's dead. Dead? And Sam bolted upright in his chair. How? Where? Found him leaning up against the gate of the Lazy L. Somebody shot him out near 8 Mile Hill. He rolled the rest of the way dripping blood. My guess is he was trying to reach Carson. He never made it. Nate says he wasn't expecting Wentworth, and I believe him. Why would a local undertaker be so all-fired determined to see Nate Carson? I'm not sure, but Nate told me that Wentworth was in the English cavalry. Wentworth told Carson that in Russia he saw men killed like Henry and John. Wentworth never told me that. I mentioned that to Nate, and he said Wentworth only let him on because Nate had seen it too before. Nate said it went on during the war in Virginia. Said it was some kind of secret weapon. Secret weapon, huh? I doubt that. I was in Virginia and I never saw anything like that. What I do find interesting, though, is that this secret weapon just happens to show up in Texoma at the same time as our local congressman. You think Carson is trying to tell us John Jr. killed his own father and brother? Well, he all but said as much. Would you put it past him? Jason asked. No. Would you? Nope. Then we got to hope Carson will help us to prove it. Did he seem agreeable? Well, I think so. He said he'd think it over. He feels the war's closing back in on him, and he doesn't like it the least bit. Can't say I blame him there. Nate might ride a wide circuit to avoid trouble, but he ain't the kind to run away from it once it's cornered. If we can keep a little pressure on him, I think old Nate's going to come out swinging. Wow. Another one. Wow. Absolutely chest-pounding. What a riveting storyline this is, seamlessly woven together in a superb tapestry of horror by my good friend, Jack LaFountain. Of course, guys and girls, if you enjoy Jack's stories, don't forget you can purchase one for yourself over on the Amazon bookstore. And of course, I'll leave a link to that in the description box below. Please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag Team Fear and DMT's Cryptid Crew. If you're an aspiring writer, want to get in touch with myself at the usual email as on screen, which is dmtforestofear@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. I hope everybody's doing well this week and getting stuck into whatever it is that you do, whether it's studying or work, and you're trying to keep fit and focused as possible during these testing times. But above all, guys, remember, be safe, not sorry.